Time Warner, but has gone on to bigger and better things and is now going to enlighten us all about the very important topic of AI and how that's going to impact Hollywood. So Doug was at our BCG AI conference in November, thank you, and was one of the most talked about panels there. So we thought to bring him back and enlighten everyone here about how the disruption and what's happened since.
And just to know how prescient Doug is, he told me this, and I have to share, even though he may have told me in confidence. He was known inside Time Warner as Dr. Doom, because
Kevin Tsujihara used to call me
Dr. Doom, because he kept scaring the company about the threats that Netflix.
I used to refer to myself as the CUE, the Chief Urgency Officer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when Doug talks about changes in business models and urgency, I listened to him because you were nailing. You pretty much laid out the Netflix, you and Spencer laid out the Netflix worries for all these companies. Some listened, some didn't.
No, I think that's a good context for what we're going to talk about, because I was running investor relations at Time Warner in 2008, 2009. And at that time, Netflix, we used to mostly worry about its effect on our DVD business, right? They were mailing red envelopes, they were using the first sale doctrine and then arbitraging that. And we thought streaming was kind of a joke. And then at some point, they did the Starz deal and they got the pay one movie rights for Sony and for Disney and 2,500 movies. And we're like, oh boy, this is a problem. And that was in 2008, 2009. And then a lot of what we thought was going to happen, maybe not quite the extent or the speed, it happened over the next 10 years. And we did a lot of things to try to stop it, and it didn't work. And so I think we're back there again, which is kind of what I'm going to talk about. So the question, I'm going to try to spend a few minutes trying to answer this question, is the threat or opportunity, and show a couple demos, and then we can talk through it. This is just a plug for my free Substack, Excellent Unit Economics at free, but I would encourage you to sign up. So the premise, kind of the one or two sentence summary that I've been using over the last year and a half is this idea that the last decade in TV and film was really defined by the disruption of content distribution, and that the next decade is going to be defined by the disruption of content creation, right? And so what I mean by that is that in any value chain, the value that resides in any value chain is a function of the moats in the value chain, right? Like that's chapter 2 of your micro-econ book, right? No barriers to entry, no moats, no profit long term. And historically in TV, there were these two big moats, right? There was a moat around distribution because you needed to own the underlying physical infrastructure to distribute content, very capital intensive. You had to dig fiber and lay trenches and launch satellites, build antennas, whatever. And there was a big moat around content creation because it's risky and it's expensive, right? And what happened was, that's supposed to be the moat getting shaky, one moat fell, right? Look, we know what happened. The internet came in, it unbundled information from infrastructure, and the cost to move bits around plummeted, right? And that paved the way for, that's the moat falling, that paved the way for Netflix, which came in. It ran the whole distribution playbook. It started with, crappy stuff that people basically ignored, and it got a foothold, and it got better and better and better. And here, Netflix today is arguably the most powerful company in Hollywood. So, we all know what happened as a result of that. And these guys have all kinds of awesome charts on, I always use Craig's chart on pay TV subs and how it's going down and how the pace of decline is accelerating, and you have great charts on viewing declining. But this is kind of the bottom line, right? I mean, maybe we could show the stocks, that would be the bottom line. But this is a different bottom line, the actual bottom line. And what this is showing is for the big 5 media companies, which I guess at the beginning of this period in 2018 was big 7 media companies, whatever. If you look at their combined video businesses, so this is traditional TV, streaming, and studio combined, that revenue's up a little bit, but that profit margins are down 1,000 basis points over this time frame. Profits are down 40%, right? And right now, everybody's running around with their hair on fire in the industry, a lot of negative headlines. When you look at what's going on, whether it's, questions about Bob Iger's succession, Paramount being for sale, RSN's going bankrupt, the writers and directors strikes, box office struggling to get back to where it was pre-COVID, all of those things you could trace back to the last disruption, right? You could trace them all back to the fact that the barriers to entry fell, Netflix came in, squeezed out the excess profits, and there's less money to go around. Everyone's running around crazy because there's less money to go around. But even as one moat fell, another moat got stronger and deeper, and that was the moat around content creation, because the cost to make stuff actually went up, right? So as the distribution costs fell, creation costs went up, and you can see here on the right part of this chart on the left, if you look at the average tentpole budget doubled over 20 years. The average cost of a premium hour of scripted TV doubled over 10 years. And so, another way of thinking about this is that distribution was subject to Moore's Law, right? And that's Moore's Law on the left, and on the right, it's healthcare premiums and sushi, right? And so I think the real question is, what happens if Moore's Law comes for content creation, right? You have an industry that's already reeling from the last disruption. What happens if there's another disruption coming? And so just to be clear what I mean by this, I'm not making the case that we're going to have a GenAI created or enabled blockbuster movie anytime soon. What I'm arguing is that GenAI will democratize high-quality production, and in doing that, it will exacerbate a low-end disruption that's already underway from creator content. So, everyone's seen this chart on the left. YouTube is now the single, and has been for some time, the single largest streaming service in the US to televisions, right? For years, the argument was that YouTube is not competitive with TV. It's people slipping on ice and cats playing the piano and whatever, and it's not the same use case. This is exactly the same use case. This is watching on a television, right? And if you think about, and it's been going up, and so if you think about what's happening, this is just a redux of what we already saw, a different kind of low-end disruption. And in this case, actually, Netflix, interestingly, goes from disruptor to disruptee. And if you think about how disruption plays out, typically, again, it comes from the bottom. And what's happened here is, you creep up from the bottom, creator content, whatever, cats playing the piano. Then you go after, as it creeps up the performance curve, the first thing you go after is the least demanding customers. And that's kids, right? The most popular kids show in the world, CoComelon on YouTube. Then you keep going up the curve, and you get to the next least demanding customers. That's unscripted TV, the most popular unscripted show in the world, Mr. Beast on YouTube, right? And so the question is, do these tools, the Pika and Runway and Stable Diffusion and Sora, do they then pour gas on the fire of something that's already happening? And my argument is yes. And what I want to do is just show you a couple of videos just to illustrate how quickly these things are moving, because I'm sure we'll talk about it, but it's moving a lot faster than I thought it was going to. When I started writing about this a year and a half ago, I was talking about something that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years, and now I think it's probably more 3 to 5. One of the hidden elements of all this is that you still need, if you're going to make an AI video, you still need some kind of technical fluency, because as I mentioned with that borrowing time video, you had a guy who used a bunch of different tools, he has his own custom workflow, and then he still needs to know, Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve. He's still editing all this together. The future is you're going to have holistic platforms where you can start with an idea and end up with a movie. And a few weeks ago, I got beta access to this thing called LTX Studio. Very early, very janky, a lot of problems with it. But I basically took this thing, and in 2 hours, I had my own movie, having no editing capability at all. And I'm not going to play you the movie. It's
Years ago, I worked at Time
I actually
Warner.
premiered it on
Corporate
LinkedIn, but I mean,
offices were attached to a
it's
mall. One bitterly cold day.
yeah, the audio is not working anyway. So if you want to, if you really want to see it, I'll show it to you. It's an anecdote about something that happened to me when I was at Time Warner. But Anyway, I think that what Sora really shows is that AI can solve video, that video is a solvable problem by AI. And what I mean by that is if you think about something like, we may never have a self-driving car because we may never societally, accept that it's inevitable that a self-driving car is going to kill people, right? The bar on video is much lower. Video is an illusion to begin with, right? It's 24 still images per second. As soon as you walk in the theater, you're seeing something that's not real. So it's got a much lower bar. And what we're seeing is that scale has tremendous value. And maybe we'll talk about this as well. But that was really the main takeaway, is that AI will solve the video problem, that's a relatively low bar. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop and we can hash this all out, is that I think another question is how quickly could this happen? And again, I drew a parallel between this last disruption and this one. And I think in a lot of ways this could happen much faster. One of the things to keep in mind is just the math of this, how overwhelming the math may be, which is that last year Hollywood put out about 15,000 hours of TV and film, and there were 300 million hours uploaded to YouTube, right? If 0.01% of that is considered competitive with Hollywood, that's twice Hollywood's annual output, right? If you think about, to me, I always think about this Game of Thrones analogy where we can argue Disney versus Sony versus NBCU versus WBD. It's like the Lannisters versus the Snows versus, I forgot all the names, the Sea Snake or whatever that guy's name is. But the army of the dead is amassed at the wall. That's what the industry needs to be worried about, is the army of the dead. So that's one thing, is just the math is overwhelming. This isn't one disruptor. This is 10 million disruptors, 20 million disruptors. I don't even know how many. The other thing is that the last disruption took a very long time because a lot of things had to happen. A lot of things had to go right? You had to build out broadband infrastructure. People had to adopt broadband. People had to adopt streaming. They had to do all these things that are now in place. As I mentioned, YouTube's already the #1 streaming service in the United States to televisions. If there was a great AI-enabled show on YouTube tomorrow, it could be the #1 show in the United States tomorrow night, right? And then the last thing is just there's an incredibly complex ecosystem in Hollywood. And what I would say is my experience with the studios is that they're very much handcuffed right now because of that. Or to put it a different way, when you think about the disruption of distribution, the biggest media companies should have been somewhat agnostic to how they distribute. Creation is much more core to the DNA of what they do. So I will stop there. To answer the question, I think it's more of a threat than an opportunity. And maybe we can talk it through.
Well, can I ask you, you mentioned that the past 18 months since you started this, you're now convinced it's going to be quicker. Is there any other nuance, takeaways that you've had since you've seen the Soras, the next generation, besides the speed of change? Is there anything that nuance in terms of that's evolved your thinking?
Well, I think it may be why it's happening so fast, which I didn't appreciate at the time, which is there's really three things happening. One is that all of this stuff is happening open source, that scale matters, and that there's composability. So what I didn't go through it in any depth, but I showed a chart which was with the dogs, where it was in the lower right. It was from this paper called Scaling Laws of Neural Networks, and it makes the point that as you add as the size of the training set goes up and the number of parameters goes up and the amount of compute goes up, that the loss rate of these things continues to fall. I mean, I'm sure it hits some wall someplace, but it's basically saying that almost regardless of the architecture itself, that scale solves problems. I didn't appreciate that. The other thing is, it's amazing how much of this stuff is happening out in the open domain, because I don't know if people talk about it, but it's amazing to me that probably the biggest existential threat to Google is OpenAI, which only exists because Google DeepMind put out a paper called "Attention is All You Need," right? And if you read the Sora technical paper and look at the citations, everything they did is just a combination of stuff that's being released publicly, right? So this kind of open source ethos within the AI community is dramatically speeding the pace of things. And then you have composability, which is Sora is a transformer diffusion model. What that means, it's both a transformer model and a diffusion model. And like you can basically use these things like Legos. So that's what's been so surprising to me is and what's driving the speed.
So building on your analogy, it sounds like either winter is coming or winter is here.
Yeah.
The question as it relates to our media companies and the coverage that we follow, in terms of the opportunity piece of it, right? So how hopeful are you that GenAI can actually bring down the production costs? Is that the big opportunity for them on the cost side? Like, is that, how else would you characterize some of the opportunities that come out of this?
Yeah, no, I think that is an opportunity, but I would paraphrase something that Ben Thompson, I think, said here last year, which is, it's kind of like asking, will the internet be good for magazines, right? Like, we all go to school and read about the 5 forces, but there's only one force that matters, and that's barriers to entry. And I think that I think there's 2 things. One is that the fact that you're going to see lower barriers to entry to create content is a much larger force than the potential lower costs. The second thing is that I think that the way the studios are approaching this is they are, as I said before, they're somewhat hamstrung in the way they're approaching it. And I wrote this piece last year called "Is GenAI a Sustaining or a Disruptive Innovation in Hollywood?" And what I meant by that is that technologies are a lot of times not inherently sustaining or disruptive. It really depends on how they're used. And so Hollywood is approaching this in a very sustaining way, right? They're trying to figure out, how do I plug existing AI tools into my workflow, or AI tools into my existing workflows? How do I use AI for localization services, or how do I use AI for concept art, or post-production VFX stuff? And that in totality, maybe you'll get 10, 15, ish kind of % savings, but then you're going to have people who are approaching this with a completely clean piece of paper, and have the potential to see much more dramatic savings than that.
And then you touched on it before, but how do you think this ecosystem, where you have all these call options on people's time and value, how will the complexity of the system impact the adoption of AI in Hollywood, right? You think about all the connecting pieces. Walk us through, why does that deter change?
Well, I think from what I've seen, all of the studios, to their credit, are taking this very seriously. They're looking at it, they're paying a lot of attention to it. But I do think that they are very leery of doing anything that would be perceived to reduce labor demands, right? You saw how AI went from being this, like, a non-issue to being almost the central issue in the writer's strike. And so I think they're really, really concerned about that perception, and AI is a little bit third rail in terms of a talent. I mean, Jim Burtson, I don't know if he's here or not, but he could talk about what the perception is of AI in the town. But the other thing is that because the studios don't actually make the movies, they attract the talent that makes the movies, they can't force anyone to use the stuff, right? They can't say to Christopher Nolan, hey, we really love that project, but you just have to use these 5 tools, right? That's not gonna fly. And I think an interesting analogy, if you think about what happened with virtual production, right? So virtual production is filming, right now, its main application in Hollywood is filming on what's called a volume. It's a sound stage with a bunch of LED screens, so that you use the LED screens to produce the set, as opposed to going on set or going on location or whatever. And you've seen empirically that it saves a lot of money, but they can't force anyone to use it. And what's happening now is that virtual production is basically like, it's dying, right? Warner Brothers built a volume in Leavesden under Jason Kilar, and then after he left, they dismantled it because they can't get anybody to use it. And so I think that's the problem is that. It's right. Twofold. It's like the sensitivity around the topic and the fact that the studio can't actually require the talent to do that.
A higher-end director is going to say, why am I going to do that? I won Academy Awards doing it my way.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan Coogler just did a deal with Warner Brothers where he's going to get back the copyright to his movie in 25 years, right? So, like, when you think about the bargaining power, I think the bargaining power of intermediaries in media is diminishing anyway, right? As all these tools get democratized, the role that that studios or labels or publishers or whatever have always played between creators and consumers is easier to circumvent, and so they don't have the bargaining power to say you have to do it this way.
I mean, you just kind of hit on this a little bit, but I'm curious if you want to go and make a controversial statement for us. Did the strikes and the settlements that came out of that, did that actually enhance the ability to allow AI to take over, or like where do you think things shook out after all the settlements and strikes?
No, I mean, I think that was good in the sense that it at least establishes rules of the road. There was nothing in there that wasn't common sense, like you can't recreate someone's likeness digitally without, getting their approval. Okay, that's a really shocking concept. But at least it sets the stage to move forward with AI. I think there's things like you can't make, I think that's emblematic. Like one of the elements is you can't force a writer to use AI, right? So there's this element, you can't force anybody to do anything they don't want to do. I think the bigger issue is really more it's the social issues is the bigger problem.
Okay. And then, so we talked about cost a little bit, so maybe digging in there a little bit further. Jeffrey Katzenberg has been out there vocally talking about that AI can eliminate as much as 90% of the cost of making an animated film. Curious to hear your thoughts, given what you have seen and what you're able to share on that in terms of the labor intensity piece of making an animated movie and the amount of time that goes into that.
Yeah, I think animation's one of the first places you're going to see it, both because of the labor demands and because if the bar is a lot lower if you don't have photorealistic humans, right? I mean, if you have a talking cat or something, then it's a lot easier to do. There's no uncanny valley with cats, or at least cartoon cats. But I think the math of it is probably not that crazy in the sense that I think in rough justice, if you look at a blockbuster, the average kind of big film, something like 15 to 25% is above the line costs, and then about 50% is below the line costs, and then the remaining 25 to 35% is post, most of which is VFX. And so, if we were to assume that you still need all the above the line people, you still need the same creative talent, that means that the rest of that is up for grabs. And right now, that's again, if you take the average budget, when you figure out just the below the line and post costs, is probably works out to $1 million a minute for most big movies. And the question is, over time, does that cost start to converge with the cost of compute, right? Could that not be $1 million an hour? Could that be 100,000 or 10,000 or $10 an hour? Right? I think that's kind of the trajectory. That's what I was saying before, is what happens if you bring Moore's law to this, as opposed to labor law.
But just stepping back, I wonder what happens longer term to the above the line talent, right? Katzenberg did not yet say, hey, they're all out of work. But given what you've said, just the math of the size of Hollywood's output versus what's on YouTube every day, it feels like eventually those gates are going to fall too. So how would you advise the upper end talent, the most creative people, to prepare themselves for what's coming?
Well, I think there's another question that you're maybe asking, but I'm not sure, which is, I think there's a question about how much AI is too much AI, right? I think there's a question that's really more about consumer acceptance than it is about technology. And you can think of these, I wrote a piece about this, or I wrote this in a piece, you could think about these kind of 4 scenarios of how much AI consumers will accept. So it's not a technological issue, it's a consumer acceptance issue. So the first scenario is that there's some arbitrary level of AI-ness that people are like, nope, too much, you crossed the line. And I think we can dismiss that one because, VFX has taken over the film business and people still go see Guardians of the Galaxy, right? The next level would be that people draw the line at artificial humans, that anything that's supposed to be a person has to be a person. I think that's, viable or whatever, that's possible. The next level would be that consumers draw the line at artificial ideas, that you need to have a human, or human in the loop, as they say in the AI world, but there needs to be a creative person who is, a story is supposed to have a story is only good if it has an emotional response, and an LLM may understand the semantic relationship between tokens, but it doesn't understand emotions, right? So, will you always need a human to overlay their own judgment on what is a motive or not? And then the last one is there's no line, and in that case, you just have like this dystopian doom loop of of infinite AI-generated content, which does not sound like a fun place to live. Right. So for me, I think that we're going to fall somewhere kind of between 2 and 3. You're still going to need real humans in a lot of stuff, and you're still going to need. I firmly believe you're going to always need some kind of creative overlays, some human to use their judgment. Yeah.
But here's where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
Which is, Ben Thompson's career existed because of the open internet, right? Ben Thompson would not be on a stage with us if it wasn't for his ability to reach us. 20 years ago, it would be the New York Times media columnist, David Carr, or Jim Stewart. It would be someone who was in a gatekeeper position that pretty much had a moat around him because of the structure. I think the question I meant to ask you is with the ability of recommendation engines and just the scale of TikTok and YouTube, is it possible that today's talent will not be next year's talent because the walls are coming down, right? The moat that created the star system and creator Chris Nolan may fall 5 years from now just from basically just recommendation engines and the ability to create at a much cheaper cost. That's actually my question. Does it reorder talent in a way that Ben Thompson's been the beneficiary of the open internet?
I think to a degree. I think that what's happening is that and I wrote another piece on this too, is that all of media is gravitating to increasingly extreme power law distributions, right? Where you have, you go back and read the long tail from 1994, the idea was that hits were this artificial construct, artificial result of scarce distribution. Once there was infinite distribution, there'd be this long tail, and that's where everyone would be, consuming 80s synth pop or, Icelandic ska or something like that, right? And what that missed was that on these massive networks with infinite choice, that there's these very powerful positive feedback loops, and that it makes the strong stronger. And so what happens is when consumers are confronted with infinite choice, they use popularity as a signal of quality, which only feeds on itself. And that's how you end up with Taylor. Not that Taylor Swift isn't talented, but that's how you end up with Taylor Swift, right? That's how you end up with these ever big, that's how you end up with Barbenheimer. Cultural phenomenon driven by the feedback loops on the network. So I think that, what that does in some way favor the very tippy top, that the network entrenches their position, like this, Drake Kendrick Lamar beef or whatever, like those kinds of things will feed on themselves, and so the top will be the top. But I think as the barriers to entry fall, it means that anybody who's not in the top is facing pretty much infinite competition. If you're not in the top, you have to figure. I think this is the case for creators too, is that they've been somewhat, deluded into thinking that they can become the next Mr. Beast, but the truth is that 99.9% of people are going to be stuck in the tail. So yeah, I don't know. It's not very. I don't know if there's other way around that.
Right.
So let's take you to the other side of that then. So on the industry right now, I think it's very clear that there's less capital being committed to scripted content from the studio side. Clearly, lots of talk, even more so, I think, as we're speaking in terms of the future of industry consolidation. So curious, does all of this that we're talking about, does it actually slow down disruption? Does it accelerate? Like if you were put in charge of a studio today, how would you approach the business differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two separate questions. I don't think it slows down disruption because I think the disruption will come from the bottom. I think that the studios, again, because of the very challenging position that they're in, which is not really their fault, but just the structure really works against them adopting these tools. So I think that the disruption will come from the bottom. And I think a loose analogy is to think about CGI and Pixar, that it really took Pixar coming in with Toy Story to shake up the industry, and that heralded the end of hand-drawn animation. And so I think that the studios are probably going to be mostly dragged kicking and screaming into this world. So no, I don't think I don't think any of that slows down disruption. In terms of what I would do if I was running a studio, I think there are kind of two broad things. One is to figure out what is still scarce as quality becomes infinite, right? And it's things like IP and libraries and the ability to market, to create stars, the ability to foster fandom. I also wrote a piece called that, like what's still scarce when quality is infinite. But the other thing is that the model has to change, right? The business of making content is getting riskier, and so you think about. I mean, the studio is kind of they manage their capital like a private equity investor in a venture capital world, right? The returns are moving more toward power law returns. You need more swings at bat at lower cost. You need to give the talent more equity, which all this ties together. You need to use the network as a focus group, not as a marketing tool. You need to have like a dialogue. You have to feed stuff onto the network, see what works, and then kill the stuff that doesn't work and feed the stuff that works. You need technology and development to sit pari passu next to each other, not the technology guys in the basement. Like you have to really embrace these tools. So I think it's going to be. I don't know. I think it's a lot of cultural change would be necessary in a very short period of time.
So just one quick follow-up would be: do you see the value of a library, clearly important as part of all this consolidation talk? Is the value of a library go up or down in this world of AI?
I think up. I don't know. I think probably up in the sense that there's going to be such a volume of crap, right? Like, I didn't mention this, but the vast majority of this stuff is going to suck, right? It's just not going to be watched. If I can make a 2-minute movie in 2 hours, like, and I don't know what I'm doing, like, there's going to be such a tsunami of bad content that I think that one of the interesting lenses to look at this whole thing, and we talked about it a little bit when this power law discussion is, like, as a consumer, what filters do you use when confronting infinite choice, right? And so one thing is the organic signals that arise from the network I mentioned, right? Like what is popular, but also what do I recognize? What has some resonance? What brand have I heard of before? And that's where the libraries come in. The other question with libraries is what is the value of the training data embedded in those libraries, right? Like, so if you're, you can imagine, I mean, twofold. One is, what's it worth it to license that stuff to OpenAI or whomever? But also, secondly, if you were to have a fine-tuned model that was tuned on your own content, how quickly could you spin up new iterations of your existing library? So I think the library now I'm talking myself into it. I think the library values are going up.
I want you to talk yourself into something here. When we first started covering the music business, and this yesterday came up in Ben's piece, GarageBand was introduced on iPads. And you go back to Steve Jobs' big, keynote. It's like, look, this is going to give every musician in the world the power of a recording studio, which would be a hard thing to replicate because it's so hard to get into a studio. So during that point, that wave of technology didn't really alter the hierarchy of the industry, I would argue. The stars were still the stars, and a lot of people made a lot of bad music, and a couple Billie Eilishes came to the top. So why is this different than what we saw in music, where we worried about GarageBand and all the tools that people got in their iPads and MacBooks, but nothing really changed in terms of the structure of the stars?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a good compare and contrast, and I think the way I would put it is that the music business changed a lot, but the labels were still able to maintain their primacy in the value chain. Like I said, a label, a studio, whatever, a video game publisher, a news publisher, they're all intermediaries in a different way. And the music business changed a lot. But what, to your point, Billie Eilish makes a platinum record in her brother's closet or whatever, in Phineas's closet, and the first thing, when she hits it, or Roddy Ricch, or I think most of the stars, the new music breakouts in the last 5, 6, 7 years, all started in Doja Cat or whatever. Like, they all start in the world of self-distribution on YouTube, or they blow up on TikTok or whatever. But the first thing they do is they go sign a major label deal. So the question is, if the labels have been able to maintain their primacy in the value chain, could studios do the same thing? And I think the answer is maybe, if the studios were able to replicate what the labels have done. But there are certain kind of idiosyncratic things in music, which is, for one thing, I mean, music is incredibly complex, right, and global, and they have the data, and you don't know that you're blowing up in Tokyo and you should now launch a Japanese tour or whatever. And so, that's one thing. But the bigger, I think, idiosyncrasy is how important catalog is, right? And catalog is still 75% of listening. The labels all own the catalog, and so they have tremendous bargaining power over the DSPs. And so if you're, Taylor Swift on the best year might have 2% of streams or 1.5% of streams on Spotify, and UMG has 35% of streams. So you'd rather be in their, in their stable than negotiating on your own. And so I think the labels have positioned themselves really well because of that. The issue for the studios is, actually, let's stick with Taylor Swift, right? Taylor Swift, if anybody could thrive without a label, it's her, and she's with Universal, right? But when she went to make her movie of the Eras Tour, she didn't go to a studio, right? She said, I'll spend my own $15 million, make this movie, and go directly to AMC and distribute it myself and keep all the money. And so I think the challenge for the studios is they have mostly, their value has come from their checkbook. Historically, that's their value. And their checkbook's not going to matter as much in the future. So can they pivot? Could they lean into these other, again, it's this question of what is still scarce? So yes, I think that's a very hopeful model. I don't think it's not entirely apples to apples comparison.
I had to ask. Robert?
I got one or two more, but we have a couple minutes. I don't know if we want to open it up to anyone here, if you're open for that.
No, I refuse.
Okay.
Categorically.
Anyone have any questions for Mr. Shapiro? We got one back there.
We have one.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I can't recite for you chapter and verse what the WGA, the studio's agreement was, but it was things like, there's still a minimum number of writers in a writer's room, and you can't force a writer to use AI, and a writer can use AI if they want to. There's some inside baseball stuff about writers get paid differently if the work is original or derivative, so they can't put an idea into a prompt and say, here's our script, can you go fix it, and then say it's now a derivative work, because so there's a lot of stuff like that. I don't think it's, the main inhibition is that, and it's, like I said, it's sort of emblematic of the general problem, is that the studios can't tell anybody to use AI. They can't say, we're forcing you to use this. What they can do is they can negotiate budgets, and they can try to control it that way. One thing you've seen, I don't have to go, but one thing you've seen just recently is moves by Amazon. There's scuttlebutt in Hollywood that most of the majors are reevaluating the way they structure their content deals, because it used to be that the talent had an economic interest in the back end, right? And then Netflix showed up and they instituted this new cost plus structure, which basically says we will own all rights in perpetuity in all regions, and whatever the thing costs, we'll give you 25% more than that cost plus, right? And so what it did is it shifted all of the risk to Netflix and to the industry and away from the talent. And so now you're starting to see a move back the other way of sharing risk with talent and giving them incentives to be under budget. And so that could be the way that you force the change, is saying, we will incent you to reduce budgets, and that might be the catalyst that gets the talent to embrace some of these tools.
Time for one more in the back. Yep. Marketing and advertising.
I mean, I'm not as familiar with that. I think that what you are seeing is just like a lot more in-housing. Like a lot of brands are now, they have their own capabilities in-house, so they're much more likely to say, we're going to take a stab at doing some of the stuff that's simpler. Like, we're going to try to do this ourselves. We don't need a creative agency anymore. So I think that's still early days, but that kind of is the question, is like, what is the value? Like, I know someone who's using these tools to create content, and he's being asked for massive discounts now relative to what he used to charge, and because the brands are coming to him and saying, oh, well, we know that you're saving money. You could do this now in 3 days. It used to take you 3 weeks, and so we want this thing to cost 1/5 of what it used to cost. And if that is a harbinger of what's going to happen, it could potentially put a lot of downward pricing pressure on agencies.
At the same BCG day that Doug appeared, we had a BCG partner, and I think they're trained not to be bombastic, but one of the partners said, what he's seeing in his early consulting is that creative agencies inside holding companies are seeing that pressure. It's pretty much coming out now that they just can't hold on to price because of just how easy it is to use these tools to create multiple amounts of content.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things that Ben was talking about at lunch, is this idea that, like, we're going to have so many iterations of stuff. And so I think that the brands are better able to say, well, we could just throw tons of shit against the wall and use that to generate our ideas.
Yeah.
Can I leave you with one last question, maybe for the room? If we change the question, GenAI in Hollywood, threat or opportunity, if we say GenAI for Netflix, threat opportunity, because one of the takeaways from what you pointed out before with your graphs, Netflix shifts, right? They go from disruptor to disruptee. So would it be the same answer that you've given on the studio front, or do you see this as a different threat or opportunity for Netflix specifically?
Well, you should ask Spencer tomorrow, but I think if anyone's in a position, if anyone has enough bargaining leverage in Hollywood to kind of to force change, as they changed them all at once, they probably have more leverage to try to strongly encourage talent to use these tools. And because they do all this stuff cost plus, and they actually line item budget every single production, they're better empowered to exert pressure sort of surgically inside the budget, if that makes any sense. So I think that they're a very progressive company that is good at pivoting and good at leading the way. I think if anyone's in a good position to weather this, they are. What's the bear case? The bear case is that in 5 years, there's just a lot of really good content. Again, if the cost structure collapses, it means that you can now generate returns in a new way. Like, you might actually be able to make money by putting a TV show on YouTube, right? There's going to be all kinds of new models that'll evolve out of that. So, like, if you went out 5 years and there's actually like good quality stuff on YouTube or on whatever, like TikTok decides to extend out the length of videos to long form or whatever it might be, do people at some point look up and go, I don't know why I'm still paying, by that point, what, $30, $35 a month for this walled SVOD service that I don't always find something to watch.
Hence, move into sports. Right?
Sports. It's all sports.
Exactly.
Always sports. That's always the answer.
Mr. Shapiro, as we call you, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.